I would point out on this question of internationalization of the renminbi, there's a story in this morning's Wall Street Journal about conversations that the Chinese government is having with Singapore to make that the next outpost for international exchange. I'm somewhat embarrassed by the fact that Martin seems to have done a better job at marketing than I have. He got the Financial Times on everybody's doorstep this morning, and I didn't get the Wall Street Journal on your doorstep. But I see there's some computer screens open. Maybe you can call it up online. I want to go back to this issue that all of you are, I think you would agree, are political economists, and you have talked to some degree about the political challenge here. I mean, at the core of this issue of symmetry is obviously sovereignty. Harry White didn't agree to Lord Keynes's plan because he wasn't going to turn over control of the U.S. surpluses to some international scheme. It seems to me the Chinese are very unlikely to do what Harry White wouldn't do. How do you get to a system that somehow penalizes surpluses if the surplus nations simply aren't willing to go there?
Well, could I just try a first answer? Why are they accumulating surpluses? Why don't they organize their domestic policies in such a way as not to accumulate reserves? Why has the quantity of global reserves the percentage of global reserves as a percentage of world GDP been going up?
And I assume you're going to answer that question.
Well, I mean, the answer I would give is there's been an increase in uncertainty, and this was really Keynes's liquidity preference. There's been an increase in uncertainty, largely due to the fact that capital was freed from any controls. And therefore, countries in East Asia were faced with the old problem, which brought down the old gold standard, capital flight. And building up large reserves was one way of ensuring against these episodes. So if you can now, one way of dealing with that is to have controls on capital movements, which is what East Asian countries also do. Yeah, but the two together, maybe they should be alternative, but they're both being used.
I mean, it would seem if Barry's right that we're moving towards an internationalization of the renminbi, if anything, the uncertainty would become greater, not less, in such a world, wouldn't it?
I think that the reason that these countries are building up surpluses is to make their manufactured goods more competitive, and that this is a boon for them, and that because of the increasing returns to scale in manufacturing products, if they get some leader position by depressing their prices, then they can scale up and produce more of these, and so it makes perfect sense for them to want to do that.
Your scheme is to make them change their ways by feeling the pain in terms of input prices.
Right.
But are the input prices, are they significant enough, large enough to actually force that kind of a change in policy?
I think we can. I mean, even Larry Summers said it last night. He thinks that there are rising costs to China because, and my impression is that it's because of rising commodity prices. I think rising commodity prices is not a bad thing if it's a slow trend. Cowdor actually felt that strong terms of trade for commodity producers is a very good thing for the world economy, and we've seen that in the past 10 years, since 2002, since commodity prices have been rising.
Barry.
So it's clearly much easier to get agreement on something like automatic taxes on surplus countries under a veil of ignorance when you don't know whether you're going to be the surplus country or not. So it is true that China is today making all the same mistakes that the US made at Bretton Woods in 1944 by resisting those kind of proposals. I think there's a scenario in which global imbalances have been largely wound down because of changes in Chinese demographics, a variety of other factors, maybe 5 years from now. So my proposal would be we come back here to Bretton Woods in 5 years. That'll be the time
When the
to-
surpluses are smaller, it will be an easier issue
When
to
the
discuss.
surpluses and deficits are small, if they are, it's easier to get agreement.
It will probably be necessary to have larger representation of the surplus countries in the room at the time. Well, I want to go back to this issue of hegemony and whether that helps make a system work. I should give you an opportunity, Robert, to respond to the comments Barry made about the gold standard. But how do you feel about the ability to do this without a hegemon?
Well, you know, I think the difference is largely semantic. International policy coordination, international cooperation, hegemony. You know, the fact is that there's always been, even if you think of it as a group of countries, there's always been one country that's primus inter pares in these things. And I think America was. The very fact that we talk about key currencies, exorbitant privilege, and so on, suggests that people did see something unique in the American position in the Bretton Woods era, which doesn't mean that a hegemon always gets its own way or will get its own way without a lot of coordination and cooperation. So I'm not sure that this is a fruitful debate. That bit of it isn't fruitful, but what I think does happen, if there's no one that has any excess power in the system in excess of others, if there is a symmetry, a complete symmetry of power, then I think the system is more difficult to work. I think someone has to have some extra pressure.
And Barry, the world you're foreseeing is one in which you're talking about a symmetry of power between the three, right?
Well,
the Eurozone, China, and the U.S.
Symmetry over time. So I would acknowledge that the U.S. and the dollar have advantage, that the dollar is the incumbent international currency. And we will really have to screw up, something that one wouldn't want to rule out entirely.
It came within a few minutes of it last night.
In order to lose, in order for the dollar's dominant position on the international scene to disappear over the next 10 years. So when I think about the global monetary and financial landscape 10 years from now, I do see and agree with Robert that the dollar will probably be first among equals, but it will have at least two significant rivals in the euro and the renminbi.
Leanne, hegemony important?
I think if you have the nth currency, the hegemon currency, then you're stuck in the sense that you can't devalue. And I think what we see with Britain and the U.S. is that there's a tendency that there's an increasing financialization of your economy rather than a focus on industry. And I think while America has benefited a lot through this exorbitant privilege, it has also deindustrialized.
Yeah, well, Barry, that's a good point. Exorbitant privilege is a great name for the book, but it does suggest, it does emphasize the benefits over the costs, and there have been real costs.
Yeah, I think having your currency be the global currency has both costs and benefits, and the issue now will be post-crisis as America begins to live within its means, something that we haven't exactly seen yet. We're going to need to export more, and we will need a weaker real exchange rate. To my mind, that's what the issue of currency warfare, to use the popular term, is really about.
Robert, before we open it up to questions from the audience, can I get you to elaborate a little bit on, you talked about the need for a well-functioning mechanism for changing real exchange rates, and you talked about the need to lower the cost of self-insurance for the surplus countries. But can you flesh that out a little bit? You made it clear we're at the beginning of this process. What do you think that looks like?
Well, you see, I don't see any very easy way of getting there. I think lowering the cost of self-insurance, you either have to internationalize the reserve function much more than it is. People, and in other words, transfer the insurance costs, or some of them, to an international body, or you have to allow capital controls as a permanent part of the system, which is what the original Keynes plan and indeed the Bretton Woods system envisaged. Otherwise, it is pie in the sky to believe that in a measurable period of time, the domestic financial systems of many countries in the world will become so reliable and mature that capital flight problems can be avoided. In fact, they won't be, and they're not. Maybe they're not even. They won't be even avoided for the core countries in the system necessarily. So I think capital controls have to come back in the reckoning. I'm not sure that if you had a complete. If all international reserves if all reserves were internationalized, then I don't think you'd need capital controls. But I think as things are, you probably need some of both. As for getting realistic changes in the real exchange rate, I wonder whether Barry isn't relying too much on market forces here. I mean, in fact, you did suggest that in the long run these would do the job, but that in the short run there might be many crises on the way, I find that an uncomfortable prospect, because I think
uncomfortable, but you're not disagreeing with the forecast.
If one is as passive as I think Barry has been in one's reform efforts, perhaps that is what's going to happen.
Well, I would say realistic rather than passive, but let me respond both to the capital controls and the liquidity point quickly. I've long been sympathetic to the case for capital controls, but I've come to the conclusion that the genie is out of the bottle and that financial markets are too big and too sophisticated. So I ask you, Robert, the following question. The Brazilians have been clever and adept at their use of capital controls to stem capital inflows. They've imposed a 6% tax on hot money inflows into their economy, and they've successfully broadened the definition of that tax. Has that limited their need to accumulate reserves or hold reserves?
Go ahead.
They're as uncomfortable, my point would be, with the residual capital controls as they were before. And if you have reasonably well-developed financial markets, it's hard to go further. On the liquidity provision, seems to me you can do this in one of two ways. You can say the fund is going to be the clearing union for the world. And I don't think we can go much further in expanding the unconditional lending windows of the IMF. So without having to negotiate a program, a country can queue up and get large amounts of international liquidity. The fund has created two windows, one unconditional, where 3 countries have signed up, and another one lightly conditioned, where the one country that's signed up is Macedonia. So there's a way, I'm sorry, maybe Montenegro, I should be sure of my facts. I think you can do it at the regional level. So I think Chiang Mai will matter in the longer run, and once the European stability mechanism turns into a European monetary fund, which will happen soon enough, it'll be possible in Europe.
Robert, do you want to respond to the genie out of the bottle?
Well, I agree. I think where I'd agree with Barry very strongly is that I think regionalization is probably in the natural line of evolution of the world monetary system, and I agree with him that there will be a European monetary fund developing out of the crisis in Europe at the moment. But it seems to me that runs the risk of reproducing the weaknesses of the central monetary fund, the International Monetary Fund, unless it too goes a bit more in the direction of the Keynes plan. And they're not there yet. I think we haven't talked about the Eurozone, which is a microcosm of actually what's gone wrong with the world economy. But we should perhaps do that. But I'd actually like, I think it's time to open
Let's
up.
open it up. Right back here. And please identify yourself before asking your question or making your comment.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear
Is it
you.
on? I'm Duncan Foley from the New School for Social Research. One thing that concerns me about this debate among economists is the tendency to treat what seem to me to be political economic problems as technical problems. I'd just like some comments from the panel. It seems to me that what White and Keynes were really concerned about was the prospect of a post-war period which was going to see the liquidation of the British and French colonial imperial systems. And they were concerned about how that was going to play out in terms of an international monetary system. I think today it's hard to talk about these problems without acknowledging that what's going on is that the source of the very high incomes in the United States financial sector are based on profits that are generated in China and Indonesia and the Philippines, and that is very much connected with the way that the exchange rates and reserve accumulation are working.
Who'd like to take that on? Go ahead.
I mean, definitely there's a recycling of funds going on here where there's short-term savings coming into the US and long-term investment going out into China. And I think that long-term investment is going into China because they don't have the reason to invest here in this country to promote its industry and manufacturing. And so you're going to have these surpluses that are being built up with these capital flows, private capital flows that are recycling around and build up of reserves and imbalances between those countries. Again, I just think we have to equalize efficiency wages between countries, put some anchor things to real fundamentals and anchor things to the cost of production.
Yeah, just one point. I think one of the weaknesses of the present system and why it's actually even less stable than the old Bretton Woods system is that the capital is flowing the wrong way. I mean, under all previous systems of international lending, you had capital flowing from capital-rich countries to capital-poor countries. And that is actually what was, that was the logic of the flow. You got a higher rate of return. Now, of course, it's going the other way because of the way, and therefore the Chinese haven't got anything. I mean, they haven't got anything to invest in except US treasuries. Apart from political objections to them acquiring assets, real assets in America and Western Europe, that is very unstable. So all that happens is you can then get the savings of the Chinese in the end financing unsustainable booms in the United States, consumption or acquisition booms or speculative booms. But just on the last point about the politics, I don't think, you see, Keynes really was, or anyone in Britain actually was looking forward or expecting the liquidation of the British Empire in 1944. I don't think it was there yet. They thought it would be in some way underwritten by United States power, but they thought Britain could still, with luck, be a going concern as an imperial power. And that was behind a refusal to liquidate either the sterling area or the imperial preference system.
Interesting. Other questions? Right here up front. Where are the microphones?
Yeah, sounds well.
Zvi Bodie from Boston University. I wonder what you think about the role of sovereign wealth funds in the future of international investment and supply and demand for currencies.
Barry?
Well, I think we have to think of sovereign wealth funds like we do other big private investors. Increasingly, I think sovereigns are outsourcing the management of those funds to the same investment managers that presumably handle your 401k. So sovereign wealth funds don't strike me as yet an entirely separate class of actors in the international system.
Could I just follow up with one thing? I don't think I made it clear the point of my question. The point of my question was really to respond to Robert Skidelsky's idea that China has nothing to invest in except treasury bonds. I don't think that's true, both in theory and in practice.
I meant more in the West. Of course, in other parts of the world they do, and they are actively pursuing an active investment policy. But I was just taking this, perhaps a theoretical point, and seeing how well it works out empirically. That capital is, in terms of theory, I mean, capital is flowing the wrong way, and that means that there must be, in a Keynesian sense, a surplus of savings over investment, which can't actually be bridged with present policies. There's a gap there, and that was the point I was making. The gap wouldn't have been there had the capital been flowing the other way, and that was Keynes's point. In the 19th century, London, which was obviously the great export of capital, it not only mobilized British savings, but also, because of confidence in sterling, mobilized world savings for investment in developing countries. Now the investment function has gone the other way, and therefore it's untenable. Theoretically, that's what I was saying.
In the far back? All the way in the back.
Yes, my name is John Smithin from York University, Toronto, and it's been touched on a little bit in previous questions. One of the main questions that the panelists asked was why China has been building up large foreign exchange reserves. Why did nobody give the obvious answer, which is that the nominal exchange rate has been fixed? Were the renminbi floating, instead of large builds-up of foreign exchange reserves, it would have been foreign investment, which, as the previous speaker said. So why did nobody give that obvious answer to that question?
Well, which is chicken and egg? I mean, yes, they fix. Of course, they erected a new Bretton Woods, Bretton Woods 2, but why? I mean, one reason was, of course, that you've given. I mean, they wanted to pursue an export-led growth. But secondly, they also wanted an exchange rate that would enable them to accumulate reserves. So I don't know which is more important, which motive was more important. Both were present.
Another question in the very back.
Yes, I'm afraid my question's a variant of that. Adair Turner from the UK FSA. I think this question of why these reserves are being accumulated is fundamental to then thinking straight about what are the feasible policy responses. And I have to say, I'm closer to Leanne's position to Robert's position. Obviously, it could be that they are being accumulated as a self-insurance policy. But I think if that's the case, it logically ought to be a stock effect rather than a flow effect. You ought to accumulate them for a couple of years, and then you're happy with what you've got accumulated. It wouldn't go on and on forever, and it wouldn't create a permanent problem. The permanent problem, I think, derives from the fact that these are implicitly and to a degree explicitly part of growth strategies focused on relatively low exchange rates and the rapid growth of the manufacturing sector, which has turned out for the last 50 years to be one of the most successful growth strategies by which you can do catch-up. But if that is the case, if that is the fundamental driver of it, rather than a self-insurance aim, then all our debates about, more unconditional liquidity really aren't going to make a difference to this growth of imbalances.
Do you want to respond?
So I really think it, obviously it depends on which countries you're talking about. I think the East Asian crisis countries moved up their levels of insurance quite significantly after 1997-98. On the other hand, China, which was not implicated in the crisis, accumulates reserves as part of a development strategy that it is now moving away from. So the issue to my mind is, does now China and after it the next generation of low-income countries graduate from the old strategy to the new one?
There's a question right here in the middle, the gentleman with his hand up, and then Martin Wolf here in front.
Thank you. Bill White from the OECD, I guess. We're talking about learning from the past and designing the future. The big lesson that I took from both Lord Skidelsky and from you, Barry, was that if you're going to avoid these sort of catastrophic sort of crises arising out of balance of payments problems, you need smooth adjustment. And for smooth adjustment, you need both the creditors and the debtors to realize that somehow they're joined at the hip. Well, my question for the panel is, do you think the Europeans have learned that basic lesson?
Is there anyone from Germany here to answer Bill's question?
Do you want to take that on, Robert?
Well, I think no, they haven't. That's very, very clear. I think they're stumbling towards realizing they're joined at the hip, but I think they're a long way. They're a long way from recognizing the mutuality of the adjustment process. And that goes back historically. It goes back to the original flaw in the construction of the euro, when the delusions, self-delusions, and deliberate delusions in the accounting of their budgets in joining the delusion of the delusions of the Growth and Stability Pact. Many people, when it started, said that the politics of the European Union weren't nearly sufficiently coordinated to allow a single monetary system to be successful, and that it would crack when it first came under strain. And I think this is the first time it has come under strain, and it has started to crack. And whether the new bailout funds, even if they evolve into, and I agree with Barry here, into a regional IMF, will be enough to prevent recurrent crises, unless the Germans accept their duty to adjust, and of course the deficit countries have also got to accept discipline. And I don't think they're there yet.
But Barry, you expressed some confidence that in time and in their rough, indirect way, they will get there.
Right. So the Euro Plus Pact does focus not only on public sector debts and deficits, but on, in principle, all the fundamental determinants of imbalances and competitiveness within the euro area. So it, in principle, focuses on the right thing. But the initial idea that its sanctions and directions would be imposed automatically at the instruction of the Commission got watered down. So they took two steps forward and one step back.
Last question right here in the front.
I'm just going to suggest that maybe we can be a little bit more optimistic about accommodation or changes, not fundamental restructuring over the next few years. Essentially, the main lesson of history is you can't force powerful countries, i.e. the US, the issue of the reserve currency, or surplus countries to change if they don't want to. So it's a question of their perceived self-interest. I agree that the dominant motive, there are many motives for Chinese behavior, but the dominant motive is probably export-led growth. But the optimistic view is I think they have realized, it's pretty obvious, that if you're a country of 1.3 billion, the second largest country in the world, you can't pursue that strategy without without destabilizing the system, because basically you bankrupt your markets. And they've got there. So it seems to me that maybe there is some optimism about possible change.
It's a great way to end this panel. I would point out that Paul Davidson, in his paper, I would urge you to go and read it, but he made the argument that while Harry White didn't agree to Keynes' scheme, in the end, the U.S., for its own reasons, did exactly what was required by supporting the Marshall Plan. So it's an interesting argument. Will there be a self-interested position that will get the Chinese to move in the correct direction? And I'll get all three of you to answer. Maybe I'll start with you, Robert.
Yeah, I think you can point out that the self-interest of countries requires them to do A, B, or C, and then wonder why they don't do it. Either one's got their self-interest a bit wrong in one's analysis, or people are very slow to understand what's required. There may be strong domestic resistances to changing course. So I think these changes come about through crisis. Crisis is the only adjustment mechanism we seem to know about.
We were trying to be optimistic at the end here.
But that's all right. I mean, crises aren't fatal, but they're very unpleasant. And we learn through being kicked up the backside. That seems to be the main lesson I draw from history, not from the very wise words of economists and other people on panels such as this.
Leanne.
We're debating here a political problem of coordination, and the idea behind the commodity reserve currency is that it could actually be started privately. These receipts can be traded privately. It's 100% backed. It's something that perhaps even China one day, with all its stockpiles of commodities, might even decide that if it doesn't build a strong enough financial center to make its currency liquid, it might decide to back it. And so I think this sort of, the point of Graham and Cowder was to remove the politics and try and create something more fundamental.
Barry.
I agree with Martin's point that in my view, the Chinese understand the need to move away from their tried and true development model. As they do that, they will have to have a more flexible exchange rate, and that will make possible the internationalization of their currency. That will be part of the solution to our past problems. It'll deliver an international monetary system more suitable to the 20th century world. And I hope we can
20th
get
century
20 more suitable than that old one, indeed. I do hope we can get there without the crisis that
hope.
Robert alludes to. I wouldn't guarantee it.
Prediction. Give us some odds here.
Well,
can we get from here to there without
that's
a dollar crisis, which is one of the things you write
the
about?
journalist's question and the academics to avoid, as Larry Summers reminded us last night.
Thank you, all three of you, for getting us off to a great start grounded in history. Thank you.